Hi, welcome my channel. Today's story is about family, self-worth, and finding true love. Madeline learns that real family is chosen, not forced. Stay tuned for her journey of strength and freedom. From the moment she could understand emotions, Madeline knew love was conditional in her home. As a child, she quickly recognized the stark contrast in the way her mother looked at her compared to how she looked at Ethan, her younger brother. When her mother smiled at Ethan, it was filled with warmth, pride, and unconditional affection. When she looked at Madeline, however, there was a certain distance, an expectation that she would be fine on her own. Her mother would often say, "Madeline, you're strong, you'll manage," as if that excused the absence of love and attention. Her stepfather, Greg, only reinforced this divide, treating Ethan as the golden child while barely acknowledging Madeline's presence. The only true source of love and support in Madeline's life was her biological father, Samuel. Though her parents had divorced when she was very young, Samuel remained a constant in her life, despite her mother's attempts to limit their contact. While Greg dismissed her and her mother was indifferent, Samuel was the one person who saw her, who listened to her dreams and reassured her that she was special. However, his love alone could not shield her from the reality of growing up in a household where she felt like an afterthought rather than a daughter. As she grew older, Madeline learned to suppress her desire for validation from her mother and stepfather. She stopped expecting to be praised, stopped hoping to be chosen over Ethan. Instead, she turned inward, finding solace in books and academics, places where effort was rewarded and success was measurable. If she couldn't earn love, she would at least earn respect, or so she thought. But even as she excelled in school, her achievements were barely acknowledged at home. While Ethan's every minor success was celebrated like a grand event, by the time she was a teenager, Madeline had accepted a painful truth: her mother's love was not freely given, and Greg would never see her as his own. The only way to escape this cycle of neglect was to create a future where she was no longer dependent on their approval. She vowed to carve her own path, to find a life where she was valued not because of obligation, but because of love. What she didn't realize yet was that true family isn't about blood, it's about the people who choose to love and support you, no matter what. Madeline's childhood was shaped by neglect and quiet exclusion, a reality she understood long before she had the words to explain it. While other children basked in the warmth of their parents' unconditional love, Madeline felt like an afterthought in her own home. Ethan, her younger brother, was the center of her mother's world, and Greg, her stepfather, treated Ethan as his own while making it clear that Madeline was merely tolerated. The favoritism was impossible to ignore. On her 6th birthday, she had been excited, imagining a small celebration with her family. But when the day arrived, her mother handed her a book and called it a gift, explaining that they couldn't do anything special because Ethan had caught a minor cold. Months later, Ethan's first birthday was an extravagant event, complete with decorations, expensive gifts, and a house full of guests. When Madeline pointed out the unfairness, her mother dismissed her concerns with a patronizing smile, saying, "You're older now, you don't need those things anymore." But she did. She needed to feel important too. As she grew, the imbalance in treatment only deepened. Greg barely acknowledged her existence, showing no interest in her life, her hobbies, or her achievements. When Ethan started school, his drawings were praised and put on the refrigerator, while Madeline's perfect test scores were glanced at and tossed aside. When Ethan joined soccer, her mother and Greg attended every game, cheering him on. But when Madeline received a school award, no one even bothered to show up to the ceremony. It became painfully clear that, no matter what she did, she would never be their priority. The only light in Madeline's life was her biological father, Samuel, a quiet but steady presence who did his best to stay involved despite her mother's resistance. When her mother refused to take her to school events, Samuel would find ways to show up anyway, watching from a distance. When Greg made it clear that he had no interest in her, Samuel reminded her that she was worth more than his indifference. Some of Madeline's happiest memories were of their secret meetings at the local hardware store he owned, where he would let her pick out small items like notebooks or paint for school projects, just so she'd feel acknowledged and special. "You are smart, Madeline," he would tell her. You're going to do something amazing one day. Despite the pain of her home life, Madeline learned to survive by excelling in school. Academics became her safe space, a place where her worth was measured by effort, not favoritism. She poured herself into studying, determined to find a way out, a path forward that didn't rely on the approval of people who would never give it. Yet, deep down, no matter how much she excelled, she couldn't shake the longing, the simple, unfulfilled desire to be loved by the people who were supposed to love her most. By the time Madeline reached high school, her path to escape became clear. She needed to go to university. It wasn't just about education, it was about freedom, about building a life where she wasn't an afterthought. She worked tirelessly, staying up late to study while Ethan received praise for simply showing up to his activities. Her teachers noticed her dedication, encouraging her to apply for scholarships to top universities, seeing her potential even when her own family did not. One evening, as the family sat at the dinner table, Madeline finally gathered the courage to share her dream. "I want to apply to a top university," she said, her voice steady but hopeful. She expected some hesitation, maybe a few questions, but the response she received crushed her. Her mother frowned immediately, shaking her head. "Where is the money for that going to come from?" she asked. As if the idea were ridiculous. Greg scoffed, barely looking up from his plate. "You should be more realistic, Madeline. Good grades don't pay tuition." Then, as if twisting the knife further, her mother glanced at Ethan and smiled. "Greg is saving for Ethan's future. He's going to need a good education." After all, the words stung, a confirmation of what she had known all along. Ethan's dreams mattered. Hers did not. "But I've worked so hard." Madeline tried to argue, her voice quieter now. "I've earned this." Her mother sighed, as if tired of the conversation. "Community college should be enough for you." That was it. No encouragement, no recognition of her hard work. Just dismissal. That night, Madeline lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of rejection press down on her chest. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she achieved, she would always be second place in their eyes. The following weekend, she met with her father, Samuel, at his small hardware store, the place that had become her refuge over the years. She told him everything, her dreams, her rejection, her fear that all her hard work had been for nothing. Samuel listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Then, with quiet determination, he said, "You should go to university. You deserve to go." "But the money," she whispered. Samuel smiled gently and pulled out an envelope. "I've been saving for years, Madeline. I worked extra shifts, took side jobs. I wasn't going to let you struggle alone." Madeline's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Inside was enough money to cover what her scholarship wouldn't. A small note was tucked inside, "For your dreams. I'm proud of you, Dad." Tears welled in her eyes. This was what unconditional love felt like. Not obligation, not favoritism, just love. With her father's help, Madeline packed her bags and left for university. Not looking back. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Arriving at university felt like stepping into a new world, one where Madeline was no longer defined by her mother's neglect or Greg's indifference. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who saw her for her intelligence, her dedication, and her potential, not as an afterthought, but as someone who truly mattered. She threw herself into her studies, eager to prove to herself that she belonged here. History and environmental studies became her passion, and she loved every moment of learning, researching, and debating with like-minded students who shared her ambitions. But it wasn't just academics that changed Madeline's life, it was Lucas. She met him in the campus library, of all places. He was always there at the same time every evening, poring over books on sustainable agriculture and environmental conservation, unlike the polished business students who spoke in jargon and career strategies. Lucas was different, humble, thoughtful, and deeply passionate about his work. One evening, curiosity got the best of her, and she finally asked, "Why are you always reading about soil and composting?" Lucas chuckled, looking up from his book. "Because I believe the world is worth taking care of." That was the beginning of something unexpected. As they spent more time together, Madeline learned that Lucas wasn't just a university student, he was also managing his family's sustainable farm. working on innovative ways to improve waste management and soil preservation. His ideas weren't just theoretical, they were practical, meaningful, and rooted in real change. He spoke about the environment with the same passion she felt about history and literature. And she found herself drawn to his quiet confidence, his kindness, and most of all, his ability to see value in things that others overlooked, including her. For the first time in her life, Madeline experienced what it felt like to be chosen, not out of obligation, but because someone genuinely wanted her in their life. Lucas never belittled her dreams, never made her feel unimportant. Instead, he listened, encouraged her, and believed in her, just like her father had. It wasn't long before he introduced her to his family, a warm, welcoming household that felt so different from the cold, conditional love she had grown up with. His parents hugged her immediately. His siblings teased Lucas in front of her as if she was already part of the family. And for the first time, Madeline felt what real, unconditional love looked like, as she stood in Lucas's family home one evening, watching his parents laugh over dinner. She realized something that brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had been searching for all her life. Not just love, but a family that truly accepted her for who she was. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of losing it, because this love wasn't something she had to earn. It was freely given, after years of healing, growth, and finding a love that embraced her without conditions. Madeline was finally ready for the next chapter of her life. When Lucas proposed on a quiet evening under the stars at his family's farm, she didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered, tears filling her eyes, knowing this was exactly where she was meant to be. Unlike the home she had come from, Lucas's love was steady, supportive, and true. His family celebrated the news, welcoming her even more deeply into their lives. For once, she felt like she belonged. But there was still one thing left to do: tell her mother and Greg. Despite everything, Madeline still held onto the smallest hope that her mother might finally be happy for her. So after 3 years away, she returned to her childhood home for the first time since leaving for university. The house looked the same, but Madeline felt different, stronger, more sure of herself. She sat across from her mother and Greg in the living room and, with a steady voice, told them about her engagement. Her mother's reaction was immediate, a sharp inhale, her lips pressing into a thin line. "A farmer?" she scoffed, exchanging a glance with Greg. "You left university just to marry someone who works in the dirt?" Madeline's heart clenched, but she kept her voice calm. "Lucas runs a sustainable agriculture company. Mom, he's making a real difference." Greg snorted, leaning back in his chair. "No matter how much you dress it up, it's still garbage work. You could have married someone successful. And this is what you choose?" Madeline's mother eyed her engagement ring, a simple yet meaningful diamond that Lucas had saved for. "Chosen with love." Her lips curled in disdain. "Is this all he could afford?" she sneered. "My daughter should have better than this." For a moment, old wounds threatened to resurface. The need to seek approval, to prove herself worthy in their eyes, to fight for their love, but this time, Madeline refused to let their words define her. Taking a deep breath, she met her mother's cold stare and simply said, "I love him, and that's all that matters." Her mother's expression hardened. "We won't be coming to the wedding." Madeline nodded, accepting the final confirmation that their love had always been conditional. "That's your choice." As she stood to leave, Greg scoffed again. "You'll regret this." "Madeline, love isn't enough to build a future." Madeline turned at the door, her voice steady and unwavering. "That's where you're wrong. Love is the most valuable thing of all. And for the first time, I have it." She walked out of that house with her head held high, leaving behind the need for their approval forever. Outside, she called her father, the only parent who had ever truly loved her. "Dad, will you walk me down the aisle?" His voice cracked with emotion. "It would be my honor, sweetheart." And in that moment, Madeline knew she had already found her real family. Madeline's wedding day was nothing like the extravagant, carefully curated event her mother would have envisioned, but it was perfect in every way that mattered. The ceremony was held at Lucas's family farm, surrounded by rolling green fields and golden sunlight. There were no luxury venues, no hundreds of guests, no over-the-top decorations, just pure, genuine love from the people who truly mattered. as she stood in front of the mirror in her simple but elegant white dress. She felt no sadness about her mother and Greg's absence. For the first time in her life, she didn't need their approval. When the moment came, her father, Samuel, walked her down the aisle. His eyes were filled with emotion as he squeezed her hand. "You look beautiful, sweetheart. Your mom doesn't know what she's missing." Madeline smiled, her heart full. "I have everything I need right here." As she took Lucas's hands in hers, she felt the unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their vows weren't just words, they were a promise. A commitment built on respect, partnership, and love that had no conditions. When Lucas vowed, "I will love you for exactly who you are, always," she knew he meant it. And when she said, "You are my home," she meant it too. Then came the biggest surprise of all. As they stepped into the reception, a familiar voice rang through the air, sending a ripple of excitement through the guests. Madeline turned, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, guitar in hand, was none other than Paul McCartney. She turned to Lucas, eyes wide. "What? How?" Lucas grinned. "I may have mentioned to an old friend how much you love music. Turns out, he wanted to celebrate with us." Paul McCartney, one of her lifelong musical heroes, had come to play a song just for them. As he strummed the first notes of a beautiful acoustic melody, Madeline could hardly believe this was her life. The simplicity of their wedding had suddenly become something unforgettable, not because of wealth or extravagance, but because of love, joy, and the people who made it special. The night was filled with laughter, heartfelt toasts, and the kind of warmth Madeline had always longed for. Lucas's family welcomed her not as an outsider, but as one of their own. Her father danced with her under the string lights, whispering, "This is how it was always meant to be." At one point, she glanced around and realized something profound. This was her family now. No more trying to earn love from people who had never truly given it. She was surrounded by the ones who had chosen her, who loved her not because of obligation, but because they simply wanted her in their lives. As the night came to an end, Lucas pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Ready to start our forever?" Madeline smiled, feeling lighter than she ever had before. "I already have." Months after the wedding, Madeline had fully settled into her new life with Lucas, finding happiness in a love that never asked her to prove her worth. She had moved on from the past, finally free from the constant weight of seeking validation from people who had never truly seen her. But then, an unexpected call shattered her peace. It was Ethan, her younger brother. His voice was hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Mom and Greg, they're in trouble," he admitted. "They've lost everything." Madeline listened in silence as Ethan explained how their mother and Greg's extravagant lifestyle had finally caught up with them. For years, they had spent beyond their means, lavish vacations, expensive cars, elite private schools for Ethan, and most of all, an extravagant wedding for Ethan just a year before. But now, the money was gone. Their home had been foreclosed, their credit cards maxed out, and their so-called friends had abandoned them. With nowhere else to turn, they had been forced to rely on temporary housing with distant relatives. Their pride had kept them from asking for help sooner, but now, they had no choice. "Mom wants to talk to you," Ethan continued carefully. "She's asking if you'd be willing to help them, maybe even let them stay with you." Madeline's chest tightened. After everything, after years of neglect, dismissal, and outright cruelty, her mother finally needed her, not because she had suddenly realized Madeline's worth, but because she had no other options. For a long moment, she said nothing, processing the absurdity of the situation. This was the same woman who had called her fiancé garbage, who had refused to come to her wedding, who had sneered at the life she had built. And now she was asking for help? Finally, Madeline took a deep breath. "I'll think about it." That night, she sat with Lucas, torn between anger, pity, and a lingering desire to be the better person. Lucas, ever patient, simply held her hand and said, "Whatever choice you make sure it's for you, not for the person they wish you were." The next day, Madeline met with her mother and Greg for the first time in years. They looked different, tired, aged, and no longer wrapped in their usual superiority. Her mother's voice wavered as she spoke. "We made mistakes," she admitted, though it was clear the words didn't come easily. We don't know where else to turn." For the first time in her life, Madeline held all the power in the relationship. She could walk away. She could let them struggle as they had let her. But deep down, she knew something important: forgiveness wasn't for them. It was for her. So, she made her decision. She wouldn't welcome them into her home. But she would offer temporary housing through Lucas's company and a job for Greg in their recycling division. It wasn't out of obligation, it was a choice. One that proved, once and for all, that she had broken free from their conditional love. Madeline's offer wasn't what her mother had expected. She had likely hoped for full financial support, a place to stay indefinitely, perhaps even a return to the control she once had over Madeline. But instead, she was given a dose of reality, help. But with boundaries. At first, Greg scoffed at the job offer. His pride still intact despite his circumstances. Waste management? He sneered. You expect me to work with garbage? Madeline met his gaze, unwavering. It's an honest job, one that provides for a lot of people. Her mother sighed, reluctant but with no other choice. Fine, she murmured, defeat in her voice. We'll take the help. For the first time, they had to adjust to a life without excess, without the luxury they had once flaunted. Greg went from managing financial investments to sorting materials at a recycling plant. And her mother had to learn to live without designer clothes or extravagant outings.